name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. In today's video, I want to share with you how you can jelly print using inks. I have a variety of inks here that I wanted to share with you today and a few different papers that I like to use when printing with inks in my creative projects. So first of all, let's talk about some of the inks we have. I have some Archival ink, which is oil-based, some dye-based inks, which are the Distress inks. These Distress Oxide inks, which are I believe it's a dye-based ink, but there's other properties in it. I also have chalk ink and pigment ink that we'll be discussing today. And the types of paper I'll be using some glossy cardstock as well as regular copy paper, just to give you a few different surfaces you can try these techniques on. So the first one we're going to try is pigment ink. What I like with these pedal point ink pads is that you can pull out the ink and just add it onto the surface. And why I like pigment ink is it is very light fast. Because it is a pigment-based ink, you're going to find that you generally will have less issues with the ink fading over time. I know someone who does a lot of stamping, and she's had projects that have been 30 years old and still look as good as the day that she made them, and that says a lot about the quality of the pigment inks. Just tapping away very lightly. It's a lot harder to see the ink versus paint. Paint is very vibrant, it's very easy to see where you've laid it down, while the ink is a little bit more subtle. So I'm going to add a stencil to my surface, and then I'm going to add a little bit of text. I'm going to go with this orchid color and just stamping it on my surface. I'm not adding it across the whole image. Instead, what I'm going to do is come in with this dot stamp. And I'm going to add in a little bit of the eggplant to this. I'm going to just overlap it in areas. And now I'm going to just add my piece of paper across the surface. And just rub it really nice and hard. With the little plates, you don't usually have to press too hard. But I just want to make sure that I get the areas of the paper down in between those stenciled spots. And there you go. So you have a lot of the different color that you've added onto the surface. And then because the stamp pad was on top of the stencil a little bit, you can see where you have a little bit of edges there, but I really like that look. Because you want this to be a little bit different than just stamping and adding layers with just ink and a blending tool. You want to try to mix it up a little bit. And now I'm going to take a second print, but I'm going to take it with glossy paper instead. And because I do have a little bit of an edge there, I'm just going to go over it with a piece of white paper, just to keep my hands a tiny bit cleaner. And that could be used, I know I'm a little wonky there, but that could be cut out and used as a border for a different size picture. And so you can see that the shine of using pigment on glossy paper compared to just the regular paper, it just definitely has a different look, and I really like this when you're using pigment inks and other inks on the jelly plate. I like using both regular paper and the gloss paper. The nice thing about pigment inks is when they do dry permanent. So the nice thing about it is you can add other layers on top. You don't have to worry about it running or having any sort of issues there. That it works very well for projects. The only issue you may run into with pigment inks is that it may stain the jelly plate like this one has been stained. You can see where I added in those darker colors, and because of the pigment in them, it has stained the surface a little bit. I don't mind because I do have several jelly plates and it doesn't distract me from being able to do my prints, but if that's an issue, you may want to stick to more dye-based ink. The next ink I want to show you is chalk ink, and chalk ink is another one of my more favorite inks. Part of it is I like the chalky look to them and the little bit more muted look. I also find that it does stick to the surfaces really well, and I find that I can usually add other mediums and other things on top of those prints once I've completed them. And so I'm going to add a few different inks to the surface. I'm going to stick with my purples. I just love the look of this particular ink. It has a softer look because of the chalk base in them. And you can also mark make as you go. You could actually make little circles with your chalk ink as you go, or make them really strong images like that. That's another way I like adding color and texture to my surface. So with this one, I'm going to add in a little bit more color, and I'm going to be using a deeper color of blue. This is a place where you can add quite a few values onto your surface. They're not all the same. And this is where you can have fun with a stencil like this, so that when you put that first print through with the chalk ink, it leads to a slightly different type of resist. And so then you have a lot more texture and interest in this pattern, and I love the chalk look. Again, it has a very different feel than the pigment, and I'll compare all of them at the end so you can kind of see the comparison between each type of print. And I even like that second one even better. Like, look how cool that is, because you pick up a little bit of this background color here, plus where the ink has resisted the stencil, and that just gives you even more colors you can work with. Let's see what a third print might give me. Inks, I would generally say, like, you can do a first, second print depending on which technique you're using, and then sometimes you get these really soft ones for your third, so that can be a really nice way of just adding really subtle backgrounds to cards or to your journal pages and just end up with something really beautiful. The only downside of these more permanent inks is they tend to stain your plate, which is not ideal for me. I've had this Gelli plate for a long time, so it doesn't really bother me that I'm running into some staining. But just be aware that this might happen with these plates and with these techniques, just so you're not disappointed if all of a sudden you run into issues and run into staining of your plate. And I wanted to share with you a demonstration of Archival ink. If you see all these squares that are on my plate, that is because I did use Archival ink on this plate and basically it didn't come off. But I wanted to show it to you since we're here testing inks, just to show you what you can get from it, and just so you're aware that if you do want to do this technique, expect some staining to happen. And what I love to do with my ink pads, especially the tiny ones, is I love the fact that you can make different patterns and designs. So you could decide just to do a mosaic, you could choose to just bring the color up the page. And so that can be a really fun starting layer for this page. Gonna add that on and add in some more purple. And use my black Archival ink pad just to add a few focal images. And what I like about this is you can really get so much in just one mono print. And the second prints end up adding so much variation. It's just fun to play around with this and see what you can get. So with this first one, I'm gonna try some gloss paper. And that's pretty cool. You can see where I did smear a little bit. You have to be very careful when you're adding those detailed images to make sure that you're pressing really solidly and not too quickly, just to get that final look to it. But that's very cool. It's very shiny. It has a really finished look. And this is where you could go in and you could add other color on top of this if you wanted to. So now I wanted to get into distress inks, because I love distress inks just because of the colors available and just the look that these have. These are dye-based inks, so they will re-wet with water. They come in a lot of beautiful colors and they do not stain your surface. They're one of my favorite ones to use for Gelli printing with inks. If you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, if you could boop that like button, that's a really great way of helping other people see this video, and it really supports this channel. So thank you so much for your support. I'm going to add some picked raspberry on top of the surface. And you're just pouncing onto the surface. It's hard to see. I generally like Gelli printing with acrylic because it's a lot easier to see what you're doing. You get the more vibrant colors. It's usually the way I use Gelli prints the most in my work is with acrylic. But I thought it was fun to mix it up, to try something different and see what I could do with inks. It's a very different flavor, and I think the thing is if you're not into acrylics and that's not your thing and you love inks, this is probably the technique for you. I'm just going to take a print with that. You can see that dye-based ink is really beautiful, and that just by adding in the first layer and then adding that second layer on top, you have a lot of those little edges, which really helps this stand out a lot more. So you can go for Faded Jeans, which is a little bit of a darker color. The other option is you can always swipe across it as well. It's just going to give you different marks. If I just swipe with a couple of these colors, I'm just going to take a quick print just to show you this. You get a very different effect. So you can go for a very smooth blend, or you can go for a very strong blend like this and just add other colors on top. It shows that there's more than one way of using your ink pads. You can use them basically as mark makers. The other option is you could put circles on your page. I know everyone's using domed sponges now, but I do like these flat ones for more mark making shapes. Put a little bit of yellow on there, and then I will take a print. And because I can't really see what I put down before, this is going to be quite interesting to see where I ended up putting the ink. Once I stained my Gelli plate, it became very hard to see where the ink is, so Again, another thing to realize about being careful with what inks you use on your plate. So with that one, I picked up the swipe from underneath it and then added in a bunch of the spots that I added ink in with my ink tool. So again, you don't have to go crazy with stencils or anything. You can just use your ink pads, your ink tools as mark makers and then see what you might come up with. And this is even more subtle. So this is very, very light, but you can always add other ink on top. So I'm gonna add in one more image, and this one I am going to do on gloss paper with just the regular distress inks. And I'm going to add in a stencil here. I'm gonna add some salty ocean through that. I'm gonna pull that up, and I'm gonna use a piece of gloss paper. So you can see that distress ink works really nicely on gloss. It has a really beautiful effect. The color looks better on the gloss for this one than it is even for some of the other inks that I've used. There's something about the color and just the colors of these inks that works really nice on gloss paper. When using distress inks, I would suggest going with some of the darker colors. I find that just with the qualities of these inks, they're just not quite as vibrant as some of the pigment ones or other ones, but I like the dye-based feel of them. I like the soft pastel looks you can get with them. So a lot of it is being aware of what works best on what surface. The last ink I'm going to show you is how to use distress oxides. So I'm going to start with a base of fossilized amber. Just going to pull these across this time. And peeled paint. And let's use a more detailed stencil like this one. I'm going to add a brighter color, like Mermaid Lagoon. This is I'm going to use a dome sponge for. I'm also going to add some Wilted Violet and Blueprint Sketch to this particular background. So the distress inks are made to blend quite nicely together, especially these distress oxides. I almost find that I like the domed applicators a little bit more for getting through the stenciled image. I think it transfers the ink a little bit easier. I'm just going to pull a print. So you can see how cool that looks. You can get so much cool vibrancy. And because of the nature of this ink, it does work a little bit better than the dye inks. There's something about the oxides themselves that have a slightly more vibrant color on the jelly plate. So I do prefer them a little bit more than the inks themselves. I prefer the distress oxides, but both are really good for having a dye-based ink for your jelly plate. So another fun way of using these inks is starting with some color on the surface. I'm going to add this flower image using the Blueprint Sketch. And what you can do, so instead of just taking a regular print, because this is a water-based ink, you can spritz it very lightly with water, and then take a print. And so you can see the areas where it went on a little bit thicker and a little bit thinner, but this is where you can really go for a watercolor look on your page. And you can do this with either of the different types of distress inks, because even you can add a bit of color to your surface and just spritz it. And these oxides will change color. They'll get more muted as you add in more water. So they do have a different property to them than the distress inks. The distress inks will basically just run, while these ones will change color a little bit. But you can see you can make beautiful watercolor backgrounds just by spritzing your ink on your surface. So I'm going to come in with a foam stamp, just add some color on my surface. And I like that, but I wanted to add another layer of color as well. And I'm going to go even deeper. I'm going to go with a Blueprint Sketch. And this one I'm only going to add a few images to it. Just going to use some gloss paper this time. There's some very cool things you can do with that gloss paper. And especially with those oxides, have a different feel and a different property than the distress inks, so they give you a little bit of a different feel. So these ones are the pigment and the chalk. And you can see that the chalk has a lot more muted look on the glossy paper, while the pigment does have a little bit more vibrancy on the glossy paper. But you can see that, again, the chalk's a little bit more muted, the pigment is quite a bit glossier. And so that's one comparison between those inks. But you can see with the Archival, it's not that different than the pigment And the Archival does stain a lot more, so I would probably stick a little bit more with the pigment based over the oil based if you really wanted something that was permanent that you could add other layers on top without doing any sort of sealing. But I think my favorites for this technique are the dye based inks. So this is the regular Distress ink, this is the Distress Oxide ink, and when you compare it to these ones, when it comes to vibrancy, I would say that maybe the Pigment ink is a little bit more vibrant. But overall, I like the feel of these a little bit better. And I think because they don't stain, and you can blend them and make them into more watercolor techniques, like this one here, I think that has a lot of benefit. And I know a lot of us will end up having dye inks in our collection. There's a lot of different ones on the market, but the ones that I have are the Distress brand ones. So yeah, the Distress ink and the Distress Oxide on glossy paper, and I think both of these look really excellent on the glossy paper. And I actually like their color and the way they blend a bit better than even the Pigment, even though the Pigment is a little bit more color fast. And I do like it a little bit better than the chalk inks as well. I know we've gone over a lot of different inks and done a few different comparisons in today's video. And I really wanted to give you the information you need to figure out the right ink for your gel plate. And so I hope this has given you some ideas on how to use this in your own creative practice. And if you're looking for any of the colors that I used or in the materials that I used, again, see the description below that has the full supply list there. And if you're looking for another video about jelly plate printing, click here. This is one of my videos where I go over how to use tissue paper with a gel plate. And it's become one of my favorite techniques. And I've started using a lot of those layers in the collage of my other projects. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.